It was as if I had let go of all of my adrenalized, scientific, effortful state that I usually carried with me throughout the day and went into a state of just being. And it was a wonderful new experience for me.
Cannabis truly is a pharmacy and a flower.
Survival comes with cooperation.
Pleasure is healing.
You're being a warrior of the weird.
I'm Lex Pelger, Director of Education at CV Sciences, and this is the Lex Files. Dr. Marjorie Woollacott is a neuroscientist whose own experience with meditation led her into the research on non-ordinary states and supernormal experiences. She learned to embrace the non-material aspects of the universe, and now suggests that consciousness might be more fundamental to reality than matter itself. If you or someone in your life has always been curious about the paranormal or the unexplained, her book might be the most accessible introduction I've ever seen to the scientific research on phenomena such as near-death experiences, energy healing, hypnosis, and reincarnation. The title of her book is Infinite Awareness: The Awakening of a Scientific Mind. It's partially a well-written memoir of her journey as a scientist, and partially a review of the data bridging the gap between hard science and mysticism. If you really seek understanding, you can't ignore either side of the coin of knowledge. And today, you'll get both when you listen to this conversation with Dr. Marjorie Woollacott. Hello, everybody. I'm very pleased to be here today with Dr. Marjorie Woollacott. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So you wrote an excellent book, Infinite Awareness: The Awakening of a Scientific Mind, and you're running this tricky line between being a neuroscientist and talking about supernormal things that happen that aren't very integrated into the current scientific paradigm. But before we get into all of that, out of curiosity, when you were young, did you always want to be a neuroscientist?
So not exactly, but I should say that I even mentioned in my book that when I was 4 or 5 years of age, I had my first scientific quote unquote experiment that I did. And that was when my mother had killed a gopher that was actually making tunnels in our front lawn. And it was dead lying there on the lawn. And I was curious about what was inside of a gopher. And so I went inside to the kitchen and I got a little paring knife, and my sister and I sort of opened the little gopher up, and I could see then all of his internal organs. And it was like this exciting moment for me of seeing what was inside of this little animal. So that was perhaps my initiation into science, this curiosity about the world. And then I should say that I went through school and was definitely encouraged by my teachers. Like in the 8th grade, I was taking a science class, and the teacher said, "Marjorie, you seem to be so able to explain very clearly, like the difference between ice becoming water, becoming vapor as it reaches higher temperatures. You might really want to become a scientist." But then what really did it for me was in the 11th grade, Mr. O'Neill in my American literature class started talking to us about becoming members of what he called the intellectual stream of people that really are the thinkers of the world. And he told me about William James, and I read Varieties of Religious Experience, and that did it for me. It's like, that's what I want to do. So that was really the beginning of saying, I want to understand the mind and the brain and know how they work together.
That's great. And you read William James in 11th grade?
In 11th grade. I can't remember now if I read the entire thing, but I read enough to say, this man really knows what I want to know.
Well, that was actually a question I was going to ask soon about what William James means to you, because in all of the writing by all the people interested in this field, it comes back to this father of psychology in the United States. So what was it like for you to explore him at a young age and then grow into something that would have interested him?
Well, I think that what was amazing to me was that he was one of the people way back in the 1800s and early 1900s, well before this time, that was thinking about exactly the same questions I had as an 11th grader. And I should say that when I was in the 11th grade, I was still somewhat open to religious experience. I'd grown up in a religious family, et cetera. And that ended when I became a student of neuroscience in college, because my teachers told me, forget that, this is a materialist world. But when I was still open to that in the beginning, William James was talking about mystical experiences and about people's experiences of transformation and unity awareness when they had these spiritual experiences, and also talking about even paranormal phenomena, saying that he was the father of modern psychology. And so he's totally credible. And I think the humor for me is that my teacher was bright enough to give me that book so that I could see both sides of William James, his father of modern psychology, where he's totally respected, and then these other things that the modern psychologists totally ignore of his writings because that doesn't, quote unquote, interest them. So I think it was a great awakening and opening for me. And then I sort of put it aside for a while I was then becoming the young neuroscientist, materialist. And then once again, after I had my meditation experience, I reopened up those books and was just amazed to remember all that he had said to me back when I was in the 11th grade.
And before we hear about that transformation, I was wondering if you could just give us a definition for a layman of materialism versus a mystical experience and what a scientist would mean by that.
Yes, and I think that when we talk about materialism, especially, so this is now, I'm the graduate student at the University of Southern California, for example, and I was in these classes, and what materialism meant to me is that if you look at, for example, the physical particles of the universe, the atoms, the protons, the neutrons, the electrons, they are the building blocks of every single thing in the universe. And this is what I would then call a bottom-up version of the creation of the universe. We start with elementary particles, they become our organs, they become the brain, and then the activity of the brain is what produces my consciousness as my neurons are active. And once the neurons in my brain are not active, for example, if I'm under anesthesia in an operation, there's no more consciousness. Once a particular part of my brain, for example, has disease and it can no longer function, I can no longer think in certain ways or act in certain ways. And the opposite of that is what I would call the top-down approach, which says that consciousness is fundamental. And that's what a lot of mystics from the last thousands of years in almost every cultural tradition talk about from their own experiences. And that is that consciousness is actually coming first, and it's actually consciousness as a fundamental entity that creates the universe or crystallizes the universe out of itself into all of the energetic phenomena that are around us. And I think they often say that it's a slight illusion that it's only material solid objects. In fact, everything that we see, including ourselves, is vibrating energetic matter that appears to be solid. And we know that it's like we think when we touch something that because our hand doesn't go through it, it's solid. But in fact, it's just because of the forces in that object that keep the forces of our hand from moving through it. So I think that is a very mysterious and intriguing idea about the universe that's very different from materialism.
Why is consciousness such a hard problem for neuroscientists to tackle?
Well, I think it is because, and I will say this from my own point of view, being that neuroscientist, it's that we were trained very rigorously in a theory of the universe, which is the Newtonian theory of science, which basically it says exactly what I was talking about, that everything is a result of the combination of atoms of various sorts coming together into molecules and then organs, et cetera. And so we are inculcated in that almost like a religion. I think people sometimes called materialist science scientism because it has a certain dogma to it that we are trained in as young students, and we cannot see any other theory as effective because, in fact, materialist science works for many, many things in the material world. I should say that when I was a young neuroscientist who was working in rehabilitation neuroscience, it was Newtonian science that governed all of the experiments that I did, the ways I tried to help patients. It works wonderfully in our day-to-day living of our material reality, but it doesn't work when you get down to subatomic particles and quantum physics, and it doesn't work when you get to consciousness. And I think it only works in like this middle part of our way of looking at reality with that lens. And so I think that what we discover when we begin to do deeper research, whether it is our introspective research in meditation or quantum physics, that now we have to leave the materialism in a certain sense aside, or at least expand it to see a universe that looks perhaps a little bit wider and broader than what we thought.
How did that go for you? What first broke you out of your materialism shell?
Well, what happened was that I was a young materialist neuroscientist, and I had a sister who is about 4 years older than me. And after she graduated from college, she decided to, in fact, live in a commune for a while. And she then met a meditation master and she began to meditate. And I still remember my boyfriend at the time calling her a bubblehead, because that is what he thought of free spirits that weren't deep into their careers like we were. And so it was like totally foreign to him. And I also remember that during one trip at Christmas time to visit my parents in Arizona, my sister was also visiting. And we were in a room together during the week that I was there, and she shared with me some of her meditation experiences and told me a little bit about it. And it was intriguing, though I was, skeptical, of course. And then what happened is that there was a plane crash that was over Southern California while I was there, and all of the people in both of the planes that collided were killed. And I'd always been afraid of flying in planes anyway, and now I was really terrified about getting on the plane to go home at the end of that visit. And I remember that we went to the airport together, and in those days you could walk up the ramp together toward the plane before you say goodbye, and she could tell my anxiety. And she said, "I have something that can help you." And of course, at that point, I was open to finding out whatever that would be. And she said, "I have a mantra." And the mantra was "so hum." And she said, "Just repeat that when you get on the plane, and that will help you." So I was ready, I was curious, and I remember sitting down in my seat, beginning to repeat it, and noticing that when the plane took off, my usual white-knuckled takeoff was totally calm and tranquil. And then I remember looking out the window and seeing these beautiful fluffy clouds down below us and thinking, this is a magical trip. Wow. And I had never been able to see it in that way before. So I think it was an instant example of the power of these syllables to literally transform my state. And I should say that I went back to my little cottage in Eugene, Oregon, and the very next day, on the weekend, I thought, well, I'm curious, let me just try this mantra again. And so sitting on my bed, I began to repeat those syllables, "so hum," and I noticed that I became very, very quiet, very, very still. And it almost felt like I was like settling down, like moving down in a certain sense in space into this place of real tranquility. And I realized that it was only maybe 5 minutes that I meditated, but it was as if I had let go of all of my adrenalized, scientific, effortful state that I usually carried with me throughout the day and went into a state of just being. And it was a wonderful new experience for me. And of course, I loved it. And then I should say, I did then put it aside and went back to my science for a while, but it was my start of my experience of meditation.
That's a great story. And how did you come back to it? How did it deepen into actually following meditation and meeting the guru?
Yeah, so what happened then is about, I think it was maybe a year later, I had now moved to teach at a university in Virginia in a biology department. And my sister was now in upstate New York studying meditation with this meditation master. And she said to me, "Oh, August is your birthday. I want to give you a birthday present by having you come up to visit me, and I will give you a meditation intensive program on the weekend for your birthday present." Now, my boyfriend reminded me that I said yes, and then I said no, because he said, "Yeah, this is all silly." And then yes again, et cetera. And she finally, I think the intensive program was full, but she got me a place at the last minute when I said, "I'm coming." And what I found is that in that very first meditation session on that first morning of this meditation retreat, we were told that the Swami was going to come around and initiate every individual there. And now, I'm a scientist and I'm skeptical, but I'm also curious. And I realize I'm there for the weekend, so why not be open and just see what it's like? And I remember he came around the room and he touched me between the eyes and on the bridge of the nose. And literally when he touched me, I felt this energy move from his fingers down into the center of my chest and literally stop right in the center of my heart. And I could feel energy then like pulsating outward that was a feeling of like love and joy flowing through me and also beyond me. And this feeling came up. In fact, the words inside of me came up, "I'm home. I'm home." And it was my heart that was my home. The first time I had experienced that sense of truly being at home. And I remember as I went back to my university position in Virginia, the very next morning at 5 a.m., I got up spontaneously and I meditated. And I did that because I had this sense that just underneath the surface of my awareness, there simmered this quiet joy, this tranquility. And I simply had to go into that place to experience it. And, I've been meditating ever since. I mean, pretty much every day of my life, I meditate unless I have a plane flight to go on or something like that.
Wow. So you just found something that worked.
Yes.
Was it tough in the beginning to be following this, but also to be surrounded by materialists who might be looking askance?
Oh, absolutely. And I should mention that in the beginning, when I would talk to my colleagues about this, in fact, I moved to the University of Oregon and was teaching there for many, many years until I retired. And one of the things that would happen is that sometimes I would think about broaching the subject to my colleagues. And if you even mentioned the word meditation, I would see like a veil go down over their eyes of disinterest and sometimes a little bit of fear. And I would realize that it was time to change the subject, and that was fine. And so I led what I would call a dual life for many years of at the university being the neurologist, the scientist doing research on rehabilitation. And then at night, I would go to my home and I would meditate. And I even had a meditation center in my home. And I actually talked about totally different things during the daytime and during the evening. And I have funny anecdotes about my poor husband who loved alternative medicine and meditation, going to a dinner party with my neuroscience colleagues and wanting to start talking about something like acupuncture. And I would give him a kick under the table and I would say, let's change the subject. And we would find something else to talk about because of my fear of losing my credibility with my scientific colleagues. And it took me about 25 years to finally say, this doesn't feel good to live two separate lives, and I want to begin to put them together. And that's when I said to some of my students in the lab, even, I said, if you want to do some research on meditation, because my students knew about this, they said that would be fine. And I found students that did want to do research with me on meditation in the lab. And that's when I began putting the two sides of my life together and doing research on consciousness.
That's great. How did it feel to do those first experiments, and how did they go?
It was wonderful. I mean, in fact, I should mention that the first experiment that actually was done was by the student of a colleague of mine who decided to do her dissertation on meditation and the effects of meditation on attention, our ability to focus. And after she had finished her dissertation, when it came to publishing it, the colleague of mine didn't want his name on the paper because he was a materialist neuroscientist. And so in a conversation at a neuroscience conference, he mentioned this, and I said, I'd be happy to help her publish the paper. And so, in fact, I ended up writing it up with her, and we published it. And she was so excited that somebody really wanted to support her in this. And that was my first paper published on meditation. And then after that, I had students who were interested in Tai Chi and its effects on attention and meditation's effects on attention. And so I've published about, I guess, maybe 5 or 6 papers before I retired that were on meditation and how it approves us in a way that you could call more related to our attentional systems, our brain functioning. So I was still doing it in what might be considered an approach that my scientific colleagues could find acceptable and I could publish easily in journals, because it was more like, okay, you practice meditation and does your attentional ability become better? Or do you actually have changes in the anterior cingulate cortex or another part of the brain? And that was reasonably easy then to find a place to publish those things.
Once you retired, did things start to pick up with being even more vocal about the supernormal?
Yes. I mean, so what happened, in fact, is a few years before I retired, I still had 2 graduate students that were working in neuroscience in rehabilitation. And I said to them, I'm writing a book right now. And the book is basically called Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind. And I said, when that gets published, it could be that I will lose all my credibility as a rehabilitation neuroscientist. And so just be aware that that could happen. And they would laugh. And of course, it didn't really happen because my materialist neuroscience friends don't read my book. So it doesn't matter. But I should say that in those years, I, of course, began becoming more and more curious about near-death experiences and anomalous phenomena, like being able to actually sense someone at a distance or energy healing, things of that sort. And when the book was published, what interestingly happened is that as I began to give talks at conferences like the International Association for Near-Death Studies or the Science of Consciousness Conference in Tucson, Arizona, people would come up to me afterwards and say, that was very interesting. And would you like to talk at this conference or another conference or be part of a symposium or something of that sort? And that's when I began then starting to do research in what we might call more the supernormal. For example, experiments in near-death studies or in, for example, after-death communication or Kundalini awakening. And that became very, very exciting for me to be able to actually step outside of that narrow box of materialism with my understanding and my experiments on meditation.
And out of curiosity about these conferences, I mean, I know neuroscience conferences can be a lot of fun getting together with all of your buddies, but was it a different kind of vibe going to these more supernormal conferences? And was it perhaps even more fun?
It was. I mean, there was no question about it. When I first went to one of those conferences, it was like, oh, this is my home. This is where I belong. Because these people were really interested in having those discussions about the brain, but also about the limitations of understanding consciousness just from the brain point of view. And they were interested in asking, well, are there ways that the mind can affect the brain as well as the brain affecting the mind? And perhaps are there ways that we can communicate when even we don't have a sensory means of knowing what's happening, for example, in another room or in another place on the planet, but we still get information about somebody living there? How can that happen? And so there was a curiosity at those meetings that I did not find about these questions at my Society for Neuroscience meetings. So in fact, I was ecstatic.
One thing I'd like to hear you share on that you write about well in the book, what is the crux of the difference between the viewpoints of yoga and science?
Yes, I think that we've talked a little bit about the scientific viewpoint, but I think that when you look at yoga, what you find is that now you're talking about people from, for example, maybe even 2,000 years ago in all these traditions that were now doing their experiments on their own mind and their own awareness in what I would call the laboratory of meditation, where they are now sitting down, quieting the mind, and they are watching in their own internal laboratory what is happening to their awareness in different states that they go into. And so instead of doing everything in an objective fashion, which is what we do in neuroscience, we ignore our own internal experiences, our subjective experiences, and we say, in fact, that they are not reliable. And we only want to look through machines, through various ways of observation, what's happening, then we trust it. So these people are different, and they then discovered that when they quieted their mind down, they would go into expansive states of consciousness. And in fact, many times they would, in fact, have their awareness leave their body. And they would be able, I think there are a number of stories. In fact, these are, now I can even talk about current meditators that are colleagues of mine who are in fact scientists like me looking at this. One person is a professor at a university medical school who was, again, an atheist when he first went to a meditation retreat with his, I think it was his significant other, his fiancée, who later became his wife. And in that meditation retreat, like me, he had an experience. His experience was actually after the first day of retreat and all the meditations, and he was a little bit skeptical. He goes to sleep at night and he begins to feel this energy moving inside of his body. And all of a sudden, he wakes up with a jolt as the energy like moves clear through the top of his head and out the top of the head with almost the sound like a bang. And suddenly he realizes his awareness is on the top of the ceiling of his room, looking down at his body on the bed. And of course, that was his change, like a complete flip 180 degrees. It's like, oh my goodness, what on earth has happened? So it's like, it's those things that happen in the quote unquote yogic perspective of looking at your own inner awareness that you have a hard time denying. It was so real. And that changed his life. He began meditating and has continued to meditate along with his scientific career, but that has changed his way of looking at consciousness from then on. So I think the interesting thing about the materialist scientist is that if they are very, very embedded in their materialist framework, they will say, oh, that was a hallucination. That was not real. I cannot trust it. And they put it aside. And I think that often if they get a few more of those experiences, they might begin to become curious when they hear other people having those experiences and begin to open up to possible other alternative explanations about the source of conscious activity in their brain and mind.
For years, I've been writing about cannabis and the endocannabinoid system. I gathered people's stories from around the world. I learned about the long human history with hemp, and I interviewed scientists about the importance of our own cannabinoids. But at the time, the positive effects of CBD were only starting to dawn on me. It took me seeing the impact that CBD-rich hemp extracts made on the health of my cousin, and the comfort it gave to some of my elderly relatives, especially the ones who are always against pot. Since then, the many stories I've heard from people using CBD made me a believer in its potential. That makes me proud to now be working at CV Sciences, because I know firsthand how hard they work to produce the finest quality CBD-rich hemp supplements. I'm proud because I know we lead the industry in research and education, proud because I know we make excellent CBD oil from true agricultural hemp, and I'm most proud because I know our products make a difference in people's lives. At pluscbdoil.com, use a coupon code Lex Files for 20% off to see for yourself. Yeah, it seems like it's almost easy to get flipped when, in fact, Dr. Jeffrey Kripal has that book called The Flip about just that experience that people happen to get, that sometimes just luck or a disease or something happens. In my case, I would never have stopped being a materialist scientist if it wasn't for psilocybin mushrooms. And I just got lucky that there was an easy path right there that could open me up. But it seems like and you collect a lot of it in the book in a really convincing manner, there's enough scientific evidence about some of these states of consciousness that you don't have to experience them to know that there's something outside the realm. And I think the two deepest of those would be near-death experiences as well as children's memories of past lives. And can you talk a little bit about this huge body of research and the stuff that simply can't be explained by materialism?
Oh, yes. I mean, I think that, in fact, near-death experiences in some ways have become the prototype of experiences to be studied that seem to give a large amount of evidence that consciousness can exist outside of a functioning brain. And I should mention that there are a number of scientists who, in fact, are also MDs that have done these types of research studies in hospitals, in fact, typically a network of hospitals, because to do the proper scientific research on this that I would say is relatively irrefutable, you want to do what is called a prospective study. And that's a study where at a particular day and time, you start bringing in all the patients in a network of hospitals that have had cardiac arrest. And you bring them into the study. You, of course, are recording their EEGs during the cardiac arrest. And you are also then, if they survive, and not all that many survive, but if they survive, you then interview them afterwards and ask them the question, did anything unusual happen during your cardiac arrest? And one of the studies was done by Pim van Lommel in the Netherlands, Bruce Grayson in the United States, Sam Parnia, who is currently in the United States. A number of people have done these studies. And what they have found in these careful studies is that about 25%, up to 25% say that they had some sort of a near-death experience. About maybe 10 to 15% have what we would call a core near-death experience where they actually leave the body. And 25% of those people actually hover above the body in some way or another with their awareness and watch the whole resuscitation process happening down below them. And so what happens is, the reason that they're irrefutable is that they then, when they come back out of a coma and they're resuscitated, the next day they will say to one of the hospital personnel or the doctor who visits them, "Oh, I saw you and you were wearing this particular color of a shirt underneath your white hospital gown. And this is what you did. And this is what happened." And the doctor, of course, being a materialist, is incredibly uncomfortable with conversations like this. And Bruce Grayson actually mentions that when he was, I think it was maybe an intern or a resident, this happened to him with a woman that was in a coma when she came into the hospital. And when she told him, when she then was awake afterwards, you had actually this stain on your tie, on your shirt when you were talking to me when I was in the coma. And also you were talking to my sister down the hall, or my roommate down the hall. And he was a materialist. He didn't know what to do with it. He said what he did in the moment was file it away, but he was curious. And when more and more people said that, and he encountered it more and more, he actually obviously began doing research in that area. So those are the sorts of experiments that we have now a lot of data on. And I don't see how a materialist can actually say that this is not credible. I mean, if you talk to a materialist who is truly a fundamentalist in that scientific materialist way, they say, well, there must have been some brain activity still going on in the brain. Even though you had EEGs on the brain, they weren't recording deep brain activity. And I think the point that everyone mentions that is a researcher in the area and a physician is that after something like 20 to 40 seconds, when the heart has stopped, all activity in the brain stops. There is no activity in the brain. And it's not just that your activity is confused, giving you hallucinations. There is no activity. So therefore, some consciousness showing you what is going on in the room and in fact above your body. And I should say often the eyes are taped shut during these various operations and things so the person couldn't see anyway. And so you can't use our normal theories to explain these phenomena. And so the beauty is that occasionally you have a curious physician and they begin doing research like Bruce Grayson and others and begin giving us more and more evidence in the area. So I think that's one of them. And just to then go on to the cases suggestive of reincarnation. And I should mention that, by the way, the University of Virginia Department of Perceptual Studies in their medical school is the one doing so much of the wonderful research. And again, Bruce Grayson is there. He just retired. Ian Stevenson was the person doing work on cases suggestive of reincarnation, and now Jim Tucker has taken his place. And once again, what Ian Stevenson did is he collected 2,500 cases of young children, usually about age 2.5 to 3 years of age. And these would be children that would say to their parents, "You are not my parents. My parents live in such and such a city or a village, and my name is," and their names were, and this happens often as soon as they're able to talk. And what is interesting about this is Ian Stevenson and now Jim Tucker would, if they could, before the parents actually looked for the original person that the child said that they were, he would try to intervene and go, for example, to that village that the child said they lived in, and he would interview people in the village who appeared to match what the child was talking about. And he has amazing evidence about the child being absolutely accurate in these statements. And I think, sometimes there might be out of maybe 35 statements, maybe a few that aren't accurate. But in a 2.5-year-old, the rest being totally accurate, it's like, to me, it's phenomenal. And I should say that Ian Stevenson never said that this proved reincarnation. He simply said that this gives evidence toward that hypothesis because there's no real way of proving or disproving it. So, I should say that when I first was writing my book, and I had read in Irreducible Mind by Ed Kelly and his colleagues these stories about reincarnation and its research, I was skeptical because I should say that one of the parts of the reincarnation story that to this day are difficult for neuroscientists to take is that children often come into this world that have had this case suggestive of reincarnation with scars related to the mode of death. For example, a shot through the temple of the head that shows up as a scar in the new life. And, our genetics course has said this is impossible. And yet here he says, I think it was something like, I want to say something like 35% of the cases, I can't remember if that's exactly accurate, but showed this type of thing. And so here you are saying, my scientific materialist worldview says it's impossible, and here is evidence after evidence, case after case of this sort. And I think just one thing I want to mention about this is all I think people doing research in this area are asking of their scientific colleagues is to be curious and to actually give government money, for example, to fund research in this area so that we can look into the veracity of these particular cases more carefully to find out if it's true or it's not true. And I think no one is wedded to whether it's true or not, but they want the money and the time and effort to go into actually exploring it more deeply.
And it's a little overwhelming as I started to read this stuff. And, in the beginning, a couple of stories you dismiss as anecdotal evidence. But once you get into the hundreds of stories where people see things that there's no way they could have seen, sometimes very far away, you don't know what to think. What's it like for you to be going to more straight-laced scientists and they just say, I won't even look at this, even though it's data. It's anecdotal data, but it's a ton. And eventually it adds up. How do you deal with it?
Well, I mean, first of all, I have comfort in knowing that, again, William James, an eminent psychologist and philosopher back in the late 1800s and early 1900s, had the same problem with his scientific colleagues. And again, he called them medical materialists. And he, in fact, mentions one thing, which is, again, a little further out toward the edge of most people's, what I would call their eye rolling threshold. When you roll your eyes about something, it means you totally don't believe in it. And so here's the example. He was actually interested in mediumship. And again, someone like your grandmother from the other side coming through a medium and telling you things that, again, could be verified about perhaps something you had lost, where it was, et cetera. And he knew a particular medium he felt was a very, very, a medium that you could really trust. And so he invited, I think, something like 8 of his scientific colleagues to come to one of these seances of this medium one evening to just watch and be curious. And what he said is, I think pretty much every one of them, I can't remember, said no, or perhaps didn't respond. And when asked about one particular person, it was like, well, I already know it can't be true. So I know that there would be some sort of an illusion taking place. And so, because I just couldn't trust myself, even if I saw it. So there is the closed nature of somebody who absolutely believes 100% that materialism is the only theory of the nature of consciousness, that it cannot exist outside the activity of neurons in the brain. And so even he had problems, and they continue to exist to this day. And one thing I want to say is that I have compassion for those scientists because I was one of them myself. And when I was a young scientist, I still remember that my uncle, who was a person who was interested in physics and mathematics, et cetera, was a materialist. And at family reunions, he and I would sit in the corner and talk about science and our weak-minded relatives at the family reunion who believed in spirituality. And I should say that it's because you've never had the experience. So if you haven't had the experience, how can it be true? And your theory of science, which is so respected in this world, doesn't allow for that to be true. So that's why the people basically dismiss persons like myself now that are doing that research. I understand. And as you were saying, Jeff Kripal's book, The Flip, talks about scientists like myself who have that experience. And once they've had the experience, they become open to looking at the research in that area that always existed there. But finally, they're willing to look at the research and say, oh, maybe it's true.
In fact, I believe it's from Dr. Jeffrey Kripal that I first found your name and then found your book.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
So thanks to him for that. He led me
Yes.
down all of these rabbit holes. And so I wanted to come back to consciousness now that we've talked to and given some examples about it.
Yeah.
If you have a way to describe what you think might be going on here, how these consciousnesses might be passing on, living on, moving around, how does this work with interacting with a brain that's obviously made of neurochemicals and has circuits that we semi-understand? How do these two things interface?
Yeah, and I think that is what we would say $64,000 question in a certain sense. And first of all, what I want to step back and do is talk a little bit about some research that I've done since I actually wrote that book, and exploration that I've done related to other people's scientific studies on mystical experiences. And that is that something that William James said way back in the late 1800s, and others have said since then, are that it appears as if when we are actually embodied, one of the things that evolution has to do to allow us to function in this world that we're in is reduce the amount of sensory information that is coming into us all the time. And so the way that's done in the human body is that we have filters in the body that are biological filters of our brain. The first filter is our senses. Everything is reduced now to these, what I would call, to canalization, to channels of sensory information that are very narrow. So we have our visual information giving us a vibratory information at a particular set of frequencies, hearing information that's the same way, touch, etc. So that's the only way that we can actually typically sense with our normal five senses. So that's the first amount of filtering that happens. And then within our brain, we have something that I call the default mode network that has been studied now by a number of neuroscientists. And this is the network that creates our egoic narrative about who we are and how we relate to the world. And it is the background story that's going on in our brains constantly when we're not actually working on a specific problem or something like that. About, the argument I had with my spouse in the morning, or a friend or a colleague or something like that. And the point is that it is that default mode network in the brain that is literally keeping us from experiencing a lot of information that could be coming into us, because it takes up our entire attentional awareness much of the time. And in fact, part of the default mode network is part of something called the thalamocortical loop. The thalamus is in the midbrain. The cortex, obviously, is where the default mode network is, and this loop is constantly reverberating. A man named Rodolfo Linas talks about this loop in a lot of his research. And because it's reverberating constantly, it reduces the amount of sensory information that we actually perceive, that we attend to coming in from the periphery, because it's the stories that we're constantly telling ourselves. So if you have a particular filter about how the world looks, it is going to affect what sensory information you perceive. So just hearing about those filters, you begin to understand how they affect our wider perception of consciousness. And I want to say one more thing about one more filter, and that is the left brain versus the right brain dominance that Ian McGilchrist has talked about a lot. He's a professor and psychiatrist from Scotland. And he says that in this day and age, especially in the day and age of science, our left brain going to our right hand, which is the side of our brain that loves to analyze things into small parts, is the one that's in control. And it is the other side of the brain, the right brain to the left hand, that is the one that sees the whole picture, that sees holistically and is curious about seeing things in a broader range. And so because we also have now this extra filter of our left brain over to our right side of our body in control, it limits us even further in the way we perceive things. So I think what I'm trying to say is that this is why, in fact, this vast consciousness that is actually out there and available is not perceived by most of us. And then we get to the experiences now of people that have had psilocybin, like you were saying yourself. And the fact that research now showing that when a person is given psilocybin, often just once, and in fact, these are in studies of cancer patients who are anxious about dying, and they have a psilocybin experience in a clinical setting, and the default mode network of the brain is turned way down in a psilocybin experience, so that now they are open to a broader awareness, and they have mystical experiences that are phenomenal. And this is work by Barrett and Griffiths at Johns Hopkins University, and they showed that there is a direct correlation between the intensity of the mystical experience and the amount that the default mode network is actually closed down during that experience that they have. And similar studies have been done on meditation by Judson Brewer, I believe is his name, from Yale University, where he has done the same thing with seasoned meditators, putting them in a fMRI, basically, that shows the default mode network activity. It is reduced, again, in correlation with their mystical experiences. They now have a broader awareness of reality. So to me, what I'm thinking is happening is that the brain is very, very useful for us in this three-dimensional world, and we need to have those sensory filters on for everyday life. And certain people under certain conditions, including near-death experiences, have the filters either reduced or completely shut off. And then we have this experience happen. And it appears as if then that consciousness, for example, in a near-death experience, can actually still function separate from the body, which is now non-functional. And perhaps then with death, that particular fundamental consciousness can then move into another state and perhaps in another few years, inhabit a new body, as it appears to be the case with these cases suggestive of reincarnation.
It makes me think of a line I just read recently, I think from Ed Kelly. Mysticism is negation. It's about getting the
Yes,
brain out of the way to let this
yes.
consciousness through.
Absolutely. Isn't that an amazing thing that you actually, it's not that psilocybin makes the brain more active to have like hallucinations. It's the fact that psilocybin makes the brain less active so that your filters are removed and now you can experience things as they truly are.
Terence McKenna, he had a great line for that where he said psychedelics turns the radio dial of your brain to the larger setting, to the fifth dimensional setting that lets stuff flow through. And that always made a lot of sense.
Yes.
I was wondering if you ever talk about how this might relate to quantum mechanics and the observer effects.
Absolutely. And, I should say that I'm not a quantum physicist, and that's a whole different realm in terms of the mathematics and understanding. But from reading the work of Henry Stapp, for example, who was at Berkeley as a quantum physicist and was very interested in consciousness, I talk about that in my book as well. We begin to understand that if you look at many of the original quantum physicists, and then even more recent people like Henry Stapp, they really do believe that the observer and the observed cannot be separated like we try to do in Newtonian mechanics, that every observation affects what is observed. And I love the fact that now we consider things like electrons as probability clouds that are around an atom, and they are only a probability cloud until we decide to actually measure something about them. And then they seem to actually come down into like a single point in space in that particular moment. But that's not accurately who they truly are most of the time, because they are in a probability state. And I think that's very mysterious. I think most of us can't even comprehend what that means. But I think one of the beautiful things about that is that now when you talk to many quantum physicists who believe that consciousness is fundamental, they talk about it in terms of the fact that the world is really a state, in some ways, of universal mind that actually then can contract down into individual subminds that can create their own quote unquote individual realities within this broader subsystem. And I'm not sure how much you have read of it myself, but I have read Bernardo Kastrup's work. And he, with Ed Kelly, has a wonderful example of how he imagines consciousness truly to be. And that is, he says it's a little bit like imagining what we would call God or infinite consciousness as being a little bit like a mind, one of our own minds that has undergone dissociation, for example, in something like schizophrenic or multiple personality disorder. And he says that literally universal consciousness then dissociates into all of the individual consciousness, the billions of them in this solar system, for example, on this planet. And what we're trying to do is get rid of the dissociation in our meditations or our psilocybin experiences and take it back to universal mind. So I think that's a beautiful analogy for how we might look at it.
That is beautiful. It speaks to how many mystical traditions have came to just that conclusion, with Indra's net and everybody observing everything.
Yes.
To end a little bit on some more practical stuff that we might be able to use for our own healing. So you taught classes on alternative and complementary medicine to human physiology students who sound like a very tough crowd for this kind of stuff. And I was wondering, which areas of medicine would impress these students the most according to the standards of Western medicine?
Yeah. And, it was interesting being with those students because, of course, they would walk into the class on the first day and they had been trained in materialist neuroscience. They were curious, but they were still, really skeptical. And what I did is I said to them, what you're going to do in this class is you're going to actually write 2 papers, and you're going to look at the research evidence that is out there on PubMed, which is the national database in the United States for scientific research. And you're going to look at the efficacy and possible mechanisms, and then you're going to write up a paper and we'll see what you think. And what happened is that when they did that, that's when their minds changed, because they actually went to the data and they saw that these things work. Now, the ones that they were most impressed by, because in fact there's the most research, was, for example, acupuncture, a lot on lower back pain, headaches, and things like that. We don't understand the mechanism scientifically, but we know that it works. The same thing happened, interestingly, with energy medicine. So things like Reiki, et cetera. And partly it was because when they went to the research, they found that Yale University, Harvard University, Stanford University medical schools were now doing research in these areas of Reiki, for example, and energy medicine, and finding that it worked. And I still remember one study I quote in my book was by a woman, Rachel Friedman, that showed in heart attack patients when they compared Reiki to bed rest to a placebo, which was relaxing music, that Reiki outperformed the placebo and the relaxing music. And it was equivalent to the pharmaceutical propranolol, which is what people would typically be given. So here you have something that doesn't have the side effects of the pharmaceutical and is equally effective. So when my students saw that, they smiled. And I should say a lot of the students decided to look into either going into a naturopathic medical school or a Chinese medical school or adding one of those modalities to their Western medical training that they had so that they could give their patients more options. And I thought that was really what I wanted. We don't want to throw away Western medicine, but we simply want to find the right place for each type of modality of really helping our patients out.
And can you describe what Reiki is? I mean, what you think might be happening there?
Yes. I mean, interestingly, I should say with a lot of the research that's been done, I mean, first of all, I should say Reiki can be done either hands-on. So the Reiki practitioner is putting their hands over different energy centers in the person's body. And what they're trying to do, because in fact, I'll take a step back. When I taught alternative medicine and complementary medicine, I invited practitioners of these different modalities to the class, but I also went to the practitioners to try them out because I am a skeptic of I haven't tried it. What do I know? So I actually went to a Reiki practitioner and then took a Reiki workshop so I could understand the theories behind this. And what I learned in the workshop is that what one is trying to do with Reiki is allow universal healing energy from this non-local energy field to flow through us into the patient. So it's not us that is doing it per se. We are simply being the channel. And so one can put your hands on different parts of the body and allow this energy to flow through you, or you can actually do it at a distance. So you can do Reiki at a distance, either in the hands above the body or to a person in another part of the country. When we ask what's happening, I literally believe that there is a universal healing energy out there because we're talking in a sense about non-local reality, non-local consciousness. And we're also talking about entanglement, like entanglement of photons and electrons. And we are then trying to allow that energy to flow into that patient through our healing intention. And I think the word intention is very important because there has been work by, in fact, Jean Achterberg, who did a study with healers in Hawaii, where she chose a healer and a person that was going to be a recipient of that healing intention, brought them into a hospital. They were in separate parts of the hospital, one in a magnetically shielded room, that was the recipient, and the healer then at random 2-minute intervals sended healing intention to the recipient. And they showed that there were changes in the brain of the recipient when that happened. One of the areas was the anterior cingulate cortex, which is a major center that is also activated in meditation and hypnosis and in the placebo effect. So there's something interesting about that anterior cingulate cortex. And so when you hear that, you realize something mysterious is going on between the sender and the recipient that literally changes activity in the brain. And obviously, we know from the research, changes the physiology of the body, often resulting in unexplained healing from the materialist point of view.
It is a tough one. Distance intentionality. I mean, it's enough to really throw you for a loop. But also at this point, we have, I think, entangled photons that we've gotten as high as low space. I think Japanese, the idea that maybe everything's already entangled, and that's what this is working off of. But it does make you nervous as a materialist that these things work.
Yes.
So just 2 last questions for you. One is, so you once used a sabbatical to learn Sanskrit so you could link the scriptures of Shiva to David Bohm's work on mind. And you had grants, you had grad students, you had teaching and writing books during your career, and then you retired. And you said in your book that you wanted to find more relaxing work. Did you find more relaxing work?
That's a great question. And I should say, first of all, that I found during my career that I certainly enjoyed even my rehabilitation research, I should say that. And so when I retired, I had hoped that I could perhaps spend a little bit less time on that sort of research and perhaps spend time meditating and doing other research in other areas. This is what I found. I found that as soon as that book came out, which was in, again, 2015, as my graduate students were just graduating, as I started to give talks at these scientific meetings like Science of Consciousness and the International Association for Near-Death Studies, is that people were very curious about the research and about the book itself. And I began to be invited to give more talks and to become the research director for the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And I was invited to co-organize the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences with Gary Schwartz, who's at the University of Arizona. And these were exciting things to do. And so what's happened since that book came out in my retirement is that I've sort of moved sideways into now doing research and giving workshops on meditation and on consciousness and doing research on, for example, after-death communication and Kundalini awakening and things of that sort. And the interesting part is that I now am continuing to get up in the morning and meditate, and I'm also doing hatha yoga and I'm exercising, but the rest of my day is filled with these joy-filled activities. And occasionally I can begin to get a little bit too enthusiastic, and I realize I push myself a little too hard in trying to find the solution to some question I have. And what I'm learning now is when I can sense that over-adrenalization, I pause. I realize that it's the process that is just as important as the outcome of any of these inquiries. And I relax, and then I move forward at a more joy-filled, relaxed state, I should say.
So you didn't slow down, but you are really enjoying the ride.
Exactly.
So the last thing I wanted to ask about was, the book was published 5 years ago. Have you sensed a shift in the scientific community that you deal with, your old friends from the materialist realm? Do you feel like things are shifting and that some of this evidence is starting to crack open more minds?
Yeah, and I think the answer is yes, and perhaps a little bit of no as well, because what I noticed is that when I give a talk at a university setting where there can be people that are perhaps somewhat skeptical, but they're interested enough to be there, what will happen is someone afterwards will come up to me and say, quietly, privately, "Oh, I had one of those experiences too, and thanks for sharing that." And I know I, in fact, gave a talk at a private company that does genetics research on their health day. And they had me come and talk. And then we meditated for 5 minutes at the end of the talk. And one of the students came up and said, "Wow, I had the most amazing meditation. And please, I'm going to read your book, and can we stay in contact?" And in fact, she's become a student member of this Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences. So my sense is that the answer is that those people who are curious definitely seem to often even remember a previous experience that happened to them and now see it in a new light as they hear me talking about it. And other people, if we meditate even for 5 minutes, have a beginning taste of what I'm talking about, and they begin to follow it up. Of course, there are also some of my scientific colleagues that simply roll their eyes, and we agree to part company in a friendly manner. And I even want to say I have a few friends that are meditators that are also neuroscientists that were trained in a materialist paradigm. They love meditation, but they cannot believe that consciousness is more than the activity of the brain. And we smile at each other. We have interesting conversations about my data, but they aren't quite yet ready to let go of that particular framework they had all of their lives.
Well, you and William James just have to keep up the good fight and know it's never quite going to be won. Thank you so much for sharing today.
I really appreciated the conversation. I think what happens often as we're in dialogue, that memories come up that are just wonderful to actually share in addition to some of the things we originally intended to talk about. So thank you.
And it's one of the highlights of your work. It combines a really great practical review of the evidence, some practical tools for health, as well as your own anecdotes. And it's just a brilliant piece of science writing, one of the best I've seen in a long time. Our guest today is Dr. Marjorie Woollacott. One of her books is Infinite Awareness, The Awakening of a Scientific Mind. And she has a number of other books that look very intriguing as well. Thank you so much for sharing from your experiences and your knowledge with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in. To listen to other episodes, check out pluscbdoil.com, listen on all the podcast platforms, or see us on YouTube. Subscribe to the CV Sciences YouTube channel to see each new episode. And if you'd like to buy any of our fine products, use the coupon code Lex Files for 25% off. If you have any questions, compliments, or suggestions, feel free to write me at research@cvsciences.com, and please follow the podcast on Twitter @The Lex Files Show, where I try to keep it fun. If you enjoyed this program, please give us a like on your favorite platform or share a link to your social media. It means a lot to us. The Lex Files is produced by Matt Payne. The YouTube videos are by Brendan Cleek. Thank you to Tina Molnar and Jasmine Morris for the visuals, and the music is by Jake Bradford Sharp. Our sponsor is CV Sciences, makers of America's favorite CBD oil. And I'm Lex Pelger, signing off.